All right, for Chapter 11, we will talk about long-run economic growth and the sources of it and the policies that help bolster economic growth. All right, and these are some of the objectives that we will cover today. So, last chapter, we looked at different ways to measure economic growth in the long and short terms. And so, this chapter, we will move on to look at the effects of different government policies on long-term economic growth. So it's not something that is guaranteed. We do see countries that stagnate and don't grow, or sometimes we even see countries that decline. And so, you know, there's countries like South Korea that were extremely poor in the 60s. They were actually more poor than North Korea, for example, and now they are considered a developed country. I mean, they are considered a miracle, how quickly they grew. And then you have other countries like African countries and Latin American countries were economically generally in better shape in the 70s than they are today. And so we'll look at some of the reasons why some countries have grown and some have not. So economist Brad DeLong, he estimated that in 1 million BC, our ancestors had an average income of about $150 a person, and that in 1300 AD, that income was the same. So there was no sustained economic growth before the Middle Ages. So people just lived the same generation to generation to generation to generation, no improvements in living standards. And truly, real economic growth or significant economic growth didn't begin until the Industrial Revolution. And so the steam engine was truly a revolutionary invention. It was mechanical power that was used to produce goods, and we still use that same technology today. And this began in England in the 1750s. And before this, most the production of goods relied on human power or animal power. And so when countries began to adopt mechanical power, they had a sharp rise in their productivity levels, which then gave them a rise in their income and a rise in their GDP and their living standard. Once we had the steam engine, Nobel laureate Douglas North makes a point that the revolution began in England because after 1688, the British Parliament, rather the king, controlled the government. And the court system also became independent of the king. And this is very important because an independent court system is important to uphold the rule of law. It keeps a country more honest. It protects property rights. And with strong property rights and strong rule of law, then you have entrepreneurs that are willing to risk, to take the risk to bring their ideas to fruition without fear of government seizure of their property. And so, once their rule of law became stronger, the government then was able to make promises regarding, again, upholding property rights, protecting wealth. They're not going to come seize citizens' wealth. And they also lowered taxes. They had a lot of arbitrary taxes and they lowered those. And so it truly became a favorable environment for entrepreneurs. So again, we look at 1 million BCE and 0% growth all the way to 1300 AD. This is just so dismal. And then even from 1300 to 1800, again, pretty dismal growth. And then 1800 and 1900, we had a bit more growth as more technology and inventions were coming to about. And then we see the Industrial Revolution, and from 1900 to 2000, our growth around the world was 2.3%, and then it slowed down a bit the last 15 years. But, don't just because we slow down 1.6, it doesn't mean that it's not a big difference. So, for example, if you look at the difference between 1.3 2.3%, over 50 years, a 1.3% growth rate leads to a 91% increase in real GDP per capita. That's huge. And then a 2.3% growth rate leads to a per 212% increase. So, even, small increases in economic growth rates in the long term can lead to big changes in living standards. And, some countries grew much faster than this because, we're looking at the average annual growth rate for the world economy, and some countries grew much faster than others. So their living standards, even just in a decade's time, increased significantly. And just to expand on this point, we see here Nigeria, Nambia, Turkey, and we have their real GDP per capita in 1960, and then growth in real GDP per capita between 1960 and 2015, and then the real GDP per capita in 2016 using 2005 US dollars. So in Nigeria in 1960, their real GDP per capita in 2005 US dollars was 3,970. And then over that period of 55 years, their growth rate, or the growth in real GDP per capita, averaged 0.5%. So again, in 2005 US dollars, in 2016, their real GDP per capita was 5,200. So, it increased, but not much. However, if you look at um, Nambia, which had a 1.8% growth in real GDP over that time period, so their real GDP per capita in 1960 was $4,000 per person. Remember, real GDP per capita is average income per person. And in 2016, it was $1,100. So that's a bigger increase. And then Turkey went from $4,600 in 1960 to $20,000 in 2016 because their growth rate was even higher than the other two countries. So, growth rates matter because it's not just about acquiring more material wealth and possessions. It's like we discussed this a bit in last chapter, but it's correlated with different health and education outcomes. For example, in high income countries, 4 out of 1,000 babies die by a year of age. But in the poorest country, it's more than 100 out of 1,000 babies die because of lack of just medical care these countries have. And what we see is higher rates of poverty, low life expectancy, high end. We talked about infant mortality, but also higher maternal mortality. A lot of more women die in childbirth, for example, in poor countries than they do in developed countries. Literacy rates are low in very poor countries, etc. So the developed countries, such as countries in Western Europe, Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, the United States, they're usually called high income countries, and then poor countries are called developing countries. And what we have seen is a lot of Asian countries move at a short period of time away from the developing country category and into a developed country, or since they're newly developed, they're also referred to as newly industrializing countries. And we also see a high range of real GDP per capita across the world. So in 2016, the real GDP per capita in Qatar was almost 130,000, and in Somalia, it was a very low $400. So the average income for someone in Somalia is $400 a year. So again, you can see why we can see why the outcomes are much more poor in Somalia, the health outcomes, literacy outcomes, life expectancy outcomes, etc. So we see this figure here, and in the green, all the countries that are green have a GDP per capita of more than $20,000 a year. The countries in the purple are between 10 and 20,000. The countries in the blue are between 2,500 and 10,000 a year, and then the poorest countries, the ones that are yellow, are less than $2,500 a year. And unfortunately, most of them are situated here in the continent of Africa. So, thanks to a lot of nonprofits and NGOs that come into these extremely poor countries, they haven't necessarily seen their incomes rise or GDP per capita rise, but they have seen better health outcomes and civil and political liberties. And so, Bill Easterly, economist at NYU, he says that, you don't necessarily need to focus strictly on income to advance quality of life. You could focus on different objectives and achieve them differently versus trying to reform the whole system at once in order to improve, for example, access to medical care. So, what exactly determines how fast economies grow? So, we're going to look at the economic growth model, and the economic growth models explains growth rates in real GDP per capita over the long run. And so this is based off of labor productivity. Again, labor productivity is the quantity of goods and services that can be produced by one worker or by 1 hour of work. And so what affects labor productivity? It's one, the quantity of capital per hour. So how much capital does each worker have access to? How much machinery do they have access to? Or how much goods to produce other goods does each worker have access to? And two, the level of technology seen as technological change. And technological change is the change in quantity of output a firm can produce using a given quantity of input. Right? So the three sources of technological change, and this just comes from new inventions that make better machinery and equipment, like the steam engine, tools, electric generators, computers, even things like air conditioning. Again, it's very difficult to work if we don't have air conditioning in a city, let's say like Houston. And there's some countries where, when it's extremely hot outside, people just can't work, and that's lost productivity and that's lost income as well. Also, increases in human capital. So, human capital is the knowledge and skills that workers acquire from their education or training in their job or from, previous jobs or their life experiences. And so, once they have more human capital, they become more efficient at doing their job. A good example of this is the Toyota's just-in-time system. So, Toyota assembles their goods from parts that arrive at the factory exactly when they are needed versus just having this backlog because it was timely to keep having to go to storage and find all these different components. And so they found, they figured out it would be much quicker to just order them right before they needed them and use them, and it saved a lot of time and labor. So we see here the per worker production function. So on the vertical axis is the real GDP per hour worked. So we see here on the vertical axis, it's denoted as Y divided by L. So it's, GDP output divided by labor. And then on the horizontal axis, we have capital per hour worked. So K divided by L. And what we see here is that it's we have an increase, it slopes upward, and then the curve starts to flatten a little. And that's because it experiences what we call diminishing returns, where each additional unit of capital yields in less returns than the previous unit. And so it's just, think about it this way, very basic example, but if we all, let's say our job was to produce memos and we had pencil and paper. And let's say we wrote by hand, 20 memos a day. And then all of a sudden we all got computers. And so we were able to write, an average of 300 memos a day. And let's say then we got a better computer. So we were able to write 350 memos a day. So the greatest return is when we first got the computers, but then as we keep gaining additional computers or better computers, we still have higher returns, at but not as great of a rate as it was when we went from pencil and paper to computer. Okay, and so this is why poor countries that start acquiring capital and uh, um, education and skills grow at a faster rate than developed countries. So you see, like in China, they had growth rates of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11%, whereas the US growth rate was about 2% a year in the last couple decades. And that's why it's called the catch-up effect, because the US, for example, already has a lot of capital per person at high levels of education, skills, and training. So they've experienced diminishing returns, and these countries that are developing, as they acquire more capital, they have higher growth rates. But eventually, as they become saturated too, their growth rates will start to drop off as well. And what we see here too is that technological change can shift the production function up. So when we find better ways to do things, for example, then it will shift our production function upward. And so with the same amount of capital per hour worked, we are now producing more, we're more productive. And think about an example is, with agriculture, farmers originally, would use the soil, but they didn't have the knowledge yet that they need to cultivate the soil so they can reuse it. And so then they would have to leave and find a new patch of land to try to grow, and it may have not been as fruitful as the last patch of land. But as they understood, as they gained that knowledge about cultivating the soil and better farming methods, then um, their production function shifted upwards. So with the same amount of capital per hour work, they were able to produce more crops than before. So the Soviet Union was communist, and the government owned nearly every business and made all production and pricing decisions. And this turned out to be very inefficient. And so at first, the Soviets increased their capital stock, and their output per hour was actually faster than the United States in the 50s. But there was very little incentive to develop new ways of doing things because there wasn't competition. Here in the United States, there's always competition from other firms. And so, firms have an incentive to keep reinvesting and find better and cheaper ways to do things and produce more goods and to differentiate their product. But here, since everything was state owned, there was no incentive. And so the innovation stalled. And so they ended up in having extremely slow growth rates and a lot of inefficiencies, and eventually they collapsed in the 90s. There's a theory called New Growth Theory that was developed by Nobel laureate Robert Solow, and he didn't necessarily want to explain technological change. It's just he treated it as a result of scientific discoveries through research and development, and that we found out. And it's true that sometimes we're trying to develop one product, and through that development, we find it to be useful for another. We gain knowledge that's useful for another product. And so it's through continuous um, innovation and competition that promotes innovation that technological change is discovered, and that's done so through the market system. We talked a bit earlier about like Russia and how they're a communist country and there's just no incentive to keep on finding better ways to develop things. But in the New Growth Theory, under a competitive market system, a lot of new discoveries are made through trying to find better ways to do things to do better than your competitor. So he argues that the accumulation of knowledge capital is the key determinant of economic growth, like knowing how to do things. And this results from, again, research and development and other advances. But a lot of it is from research development done at, through companies, but also done at the university levels. And physical capital, for example, like is a private good, it's rival, it's excludable. Like you can have a machine and it's, you can exclude someone from using it, for example, and it could rival someone else's machine. But knowledge capital is non-rival, not excludable. So once that knowledge is out, everyone has access to it, and so this everyone can implement it, and so this results in increasing returns in the economy level. So the government can help promote knowledge capital. So, for example, they provide patents because, again, it can be expensive for an entrepreneur, to invest his time in trying to develop a product. Think about all the time Elon Musk has spent, for example, in his inventions, and there wouldn't be an incentive if everyone could just easily adapt it, and he couldn't make a profit. So they can promote knowledge capital by giving patents and copyrights. They can promote it through subsidizing research and development, and this happens a lot at the university level where they give grants to students, usually PhD students, that are conducting research and development, and professors. And subsidizing education, the better educated society is, and usually the more knowledge capital that results from it. So again, patents, they can issue patents to protect intellectual property, and patents are the exclusive right to produce a product for a period of 20 years from the date the patent application is filed with the government. And so, a lot of like pharmaceuticals, now pharmaceutical patents are a bit shorter. A lot of pharmaceutical companies to develop a new drug, it does take a lot of money. It does take a lot of research and testing, etc., to bring it to market. And so, they usually get a patent, and then once that patent expires, like a generic can come on the market, but that patent's designed to help them make a profit from their invention and to keep the incentive to do so for new drugs. And then copyrights are similar, but they're for creative works like books and films or art designs, etc. So they can subsidize, like NASA is subsidized by the government, National Institutes of Health, again, subsidize researchers at universities. And then they can also provide tax incentives. So a lot of firms, they can submit a report of all their R&D, and they can get a tax credit based on their R&D at the end. So a lot of incentives there. And then, of course, subsidizing education. And a lot of high income countries do provide, grants, scholarships, etc., for students to go to, especially the brightest students, to go to universities so they can work on, research and development. So Joseph Schumpeter was born in Austria, and he moved to the United States as a young adult, and he emphasized that whenever we have new technologies introduce new products, that it destroys old technology and products. So, for example, we used to travel by horse-drawn carriage, and now we use cars. We used to use Walkmans, and now we use MP3 players or our phones to listen to music, for example. And so he argued that what's central to economic growth is the entrepreneurs, and then the profits that entrepreneurs make provides the incentive for bringing together all the factors of production, labor, capital, natural resources, right? Like entrepreneurs don't do it just to be benevolent. Like they want to make money themselves too. And so that's one of the goals of them putting all that time and effort and resources to developing a new technology. So let's talk a bit about economic growth in the United States. So before 1900, growth rates in the United States, it was decent, but like this slide say, they were modest, 1.3%. And in the 20th century, the government invested very heavily in research and development, and this increased in higher growth rates. You could see from 1900 and 1949, it was 2.2%. 1950 to 1973, it was 2.6%. And then from 1974 and 1995, there was a bit of a lull. And then with 1996, the tech industry took off. We had the invention of the internet, computers became more accessible, cell phones, etc. And look at today where, COVID hit and a lot of us are able to work and do school from home, whereas, in the 1950s, that would have been impossible almost. They didn't have internet during that time. There was no Zoom calls. Not even in the 80s, they didn't have that technology. And then, and we see from 2006 up until recently, growth rates again have been kind of slower again. So if we look at the years of 1974 and 1995, it was a bit of a slower growth again. And so, um, and economists argue that, there wasn't really a slowdown in economic growth. It's the way we measure that made it look like there was a slowdown. So in the 70s, we really became a lot more of a service oriented economy, and improvements in services are much harder to measure than improvements in goods. We can measure an improvement from, a car in 1970 versus a car in 1975, in 1980, etc. But for services, how do you measure an improvement, let's say, in accounting service, like someone who does your taxes or a haircut, for example, etc.? And then another argument is that America during this time period focused a lot more on quality of life issues like health and safety, environmental regulations, change in educational focus. And so what we also see is that other high income countries also experience kind of a lull in their growth rates. So it's not like the United States just had this down period and the rest of the country was, the rest of the world was just growing extremely quick. It just seemed to be worldwide. And so, again, we saw that the last decade or so, we had, again, slower growth rates. And so, you know, new technology did help a lot of labor productivity, like we just talked about, better computers. We can work from our phones these days, etc. And so some economists argue that changes in the quality of service have really rapidly improved over the last decade and a half, which is true, because we do have more technology in our fingertips to be able to conduct services. Like you said, right, we can, do things faster. For example, someone can calculate your taxes a lot faster these days than they could, 40 years ago, etc. So they argue that GDP growth has actually been understated because a lot of times we're looking at it through quality improvements in actual goods versus services. So Larry Summers has argued that growth rates are likely to remain low in the coming years. He says that one, the population growth in the United States has slowed down, so it's going to reduce the demand for housing, and modern IT firms require less capital than older firms. It's true they don't require as much equipment, and then the price of capital has fallen to other relative to other goods. And so Summer says that we just don't need, a lot of firms don't need the same amount of capital as they used to. But other critics say that the reason the growth rates have been low is due to the Great Recession and how slow the United States was to rebound. And so, if you look at the average rate of growth during that time period, if you factor out the years of the Great Recession, it would be higher. So why do we still have poor countries? And well, some countries are catching up, as they gain more and more capital. Like we talked about before, their increases in productivity are going to be higher than a country like the United States, where we see diminishing returns to capital. And so what we see is that poor countries initially, as they gain more capital, they have higher growth rates, but then as they approach developed country status, their growth rates slow down. And so this is called the catch up effect. And that's the prediction that the level of GDP per capita in poor countries will grow faster than in rich countries. So, like I said, China has had overall the last 20 years much higher growth rates than in the United States, but that's because they instituted a series of reforms, became more market based, acquired a lot of capital, and so they were experiencing the catch up effect. So if you look at countries like on the right hand side, like Luxembourg, Switzerland, United States, they have in 1960 high real GDP per capita, and their annual growth rates were between 2 and 3%. Whereas if you look at Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, their growth rate, their real GDP per capita in 1960 was low. It was below 5,000 per person. But if you look at their average annual growth rate between 1960 and 2014, you can see they were much higher than the United States, because during this time period is when those countries started acquiring more and more capitals and undertaking government reforms to encourage a market-based system. And so we saw, South Korea, for example, had almost a 7% growth rate during that time period. Unfortunately, a lot of countries have not been catching up. You can see even below zero, so, vertical axis annual growth rate of real GDP per capita in 1960, 2014. You can see some countries like Niger and Democratic Republic of the Congo have actually had negative growth rates. They've declined due to like war, etc. And then again, we have the United States, where its real GDP per capita in 1960 was much higher than most countries, and their growth rate again was lower at 2%. And then other countries that instituted more market-based reforms, started acquiring capital, had much higher growth rates, like Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. All right, so the blue bars here is real GDP per capita in 1990 relative to the United States. And then the red bars show real GDP per capita in 2016 relative to the United States. And so in each case, the red bar is lower. In some cases, like Germany, it's pretty much even, but in most other countries, it's lower. And so these countries are actually not catching up to the United States, because you could see United Kingdom in 1990, their share of real GDP per capita relative to U.S. real GDP per capita was higher than it was in 2016. And we see this for France, for Italy, for Spain, Japan, and Canada. And so each country has its different reasons for why that is. They have different economic issues. I know Japan faced like a financial crisis in the 90s, for example, etc. And so to expand upon this point, one, U.S. labor markets are flexible compared to most other countries. Hiring and firing workers is pretty easy here in the United States. We don't have a lot of government regulation, but in Europe, for example, it can be very difficult to fire someone, and so that leads to less productivity. Like, someone may not be doing their job well, they might not be good at their job, they're not productive, but it's so difficult to fire them. Whereas in the United States, people get fired much easier, and a more productive person takes their place. And also, just American workers tend to have a longer work life. They usually enter the workforce earlier than Europeans, and they retire later than Europeans. Also, our financial system here in the United States is efficient, and we have a high volume of trading. So there's high liquidity, meaning there's a lot of cash available. And so a lot of foreign investors put put their money here in the United States. They see it as a very solid bet with good return potential. And so, low income countries, some of them have not really been growing, or they've had very low growth. One of the biggest ones is that there's just no rule of law. There may be one written on the books, but it's not enforced. The court system's corrupt. People can just bribe their buddies and get their way. Wars is always a big one, a revolution. Poor public education and health. And then low rates of saving and investment. So remember, in a closed economy, savings equals investment. But in other countries, United States, we do have a government deficit here, but we have a lot of foreign money coming in. Whereas in poor countries, you don't get a lot of investors pouring money in there because they don't see a potential rate of return, or at least not a high one most of the time. And so, rule of law is the ability of a government to enforce the laws of the country, being able to protect private property, being able to enforce contracts. If someone cheats you out of something here in the United States, you can take them to court. The government doesn't seize your land, and if they do, they require to pay it under eminent domain. And so, for an entrepreneur to put so much time and resources and risk in their product, there has to be some rule of law for them, or else there's just very little incentive for them to risk starting a business. So there's a lot of talk that China's communist, and there's still parts of China that are more communist than others, but other places like Beijing and Hong Kong have instituted market-based reforms, and that has led to high growth. So we have seen that China has grown much quicker than Mexico, because Mexico still has a poor rule of law, a poor court system, a lot of government corruption. And so, Mexico's GDP per capita remains higher of China's, but China is poised to overtake it. If a country is in a war, the general public entrepreneurs there usually don't decide that's a good time for them to open up their business. They hold back since things are uncertain, and also foreign investors hold back too, or they take their money out. So we see Ethiopia's real GDP per capita was lower in 2003 than in 1965 due to revolution, civil wars, and other wars. But when it returned to peace and stability, they had a lot of growth, actually 10% per year from 2003 to 2016. Also, when public schools are poor, and in a lot of countries, kids aren't even required to go to school beyond a certain point, especially females. Sometimes they're not required at all. And so, without an education and knowledge, workers aren't as productive. And also poor healthcare. When workers are sick and they don't get proper treatment, again, it's hard for them to be productive, and low rates of saving and investment. So when financial systems are not efficient, when they're insecure, they're corrupt, people tend to hide their money under their mattress, for example, and not invest it, not put it in a bank, not invest it in projects if the bank doesn't have deposits and they don't have as much money to loan out, etc. And, countries with low savings can get foreign investment to help them grow. One is foreign direct investment, and that's the purchase or building by a firm of a facility in a foreign country. So if I open up a widget shop in another country, let's say I open up a widget shop in Mexico, that's foreign direct investment. But if I buy a Mexican bond or Mexican stock, then that's foreign portfolio investment. And so that can help a country grow even when domestically they don't have a lot of savings for investment. In the Great Depression and World War II, low-income countries were hurt by falling exports, and so they cut themselves off from trade. They became an autarky. And what they saw is that countries that didn't trade had lower growth rates than countries that did trade. And so a lot of countries in the 80s reversed these policies. And so we had the era of globalization, and a lot of countries did trade with each other. And what we have seen again across the board is that countries that engaged in global trade had much higher rates of growth than countries that didn't. So, what can help a country grow? Number one, definitely have a strong rule of law and enforce property rights. Again, when a country is corrupt, it's a disincentive for entrepreneurs. It's a disincentive even for the brightest people. And a lot of times they experience what they call a brain drain, where their brightest people go to another country for better opportunities. Also, improving healthcare access and healthcare quality and educating the public more. And also, policies that help promote technological change as well. So, have policies that do attract foreign investors and policies that promote savings and investments, such as tax incentives like tax deferred savings plans or investment tax credits, as we saw with the R&D tax credits, etc. So, there is a trade off with economic growth. Sometimes it comes at the cost of pollution and climate change. Also, we have to protect our resources, and sometimes our resources do get depleted, and some animals are near extinction. And then we also see some distinctive cultures that over time get diminished and sometimes completely eradicated with the modern world. And that concludes chapter 11.